Hello and welcome back, goats, to the Big Blue Purple channel. In this video, we'll be looking at my top 7 alliance raids in Final Fantasy XIV. This is a part 2 to my previous alliance raid ranking, where we went over the bottom 7 alliance raids. Before we get into the ranking, I just wanted to say that only 3.6% of you are subscribed to the Big Blue Purple channel. Thank you for your continuous support. And also just a quick disclaimer before we get into the ranking, I will not be considering the storylines of any of these alliance raids when ranking them based on quality. This will purely be from a gameplay standpoint. Without further ado, let's get right into it. Coming in at the number 7 spot, we have the Puppets Bunker. This is the second Nier raid, and it's also my second favorite Nier raid. Just like the Copied Factory, which was the last raid we talked about in the previous video, this raid is very long. I believe my footage clocked in around 39 minutes for a single run of this, which is still a little bit shorter than the Copied Factory and shorter than the Tower Up Paradigm's Breach as well, which we'll talk about later, spoilers. Point is, all these Nier raids are very long, and for some people that's going to be a downside, especially if you're only considering roulette and the time it takes to complete it versus like Circus Tower per se. I personally enjoy the longer alliance raids, and you'll see that my ranking reflects this. I feel like length can actually benefit alliance raids a lot, in the sense where they have more time to experiment with unique mechanics individual to that raid, and they also have more time to create a huge cinematic experience while you're walking through this, 35 plus minute activity. The Aegis unit is the first boss in the Puppets Bunker. It's one of those bosses where you have the alliances spread out around the boss, which is positioned in the center, and I always seem to love this formula. I feel like I can't think of a single instance in alliance raids where I don't like a boss that's like this, because I feel like it gives more responsibility to each of the alliances, rather than just picking like 2 random players to resolve a mechanic, and then the other 22 people just hit the boss and ignore everything. In terms of actual mechanics though, this fight is very straightforward. Pretty much everything you see is going to be reactable, and it's one of those fights where you just gotta pay attention to what the boss is doing and act accordingly. Everything is telegraphed very well, and it's easy to understand what is happening. I feel like a boss like this being complemented by the absolutely banging Nier OST makes it feel so much more epic than it actually is, but it somehow seems to add so much to all of these fights within the Nier raids. Music is such an important aspect of this game, and it makes some of these fights feel so much more epic and cinematic than they would otherwise. There's a mechanic in this fight where the boss will shoot out kind of these ring AoEs, and you need to stand in the gaps between them. It's a super simple mechanic, but it's a nice way to kind of disguise a typical AoE mechanic and make it unique to the raid it's in. It's still the same dodge as any other kind of mechanic, but because it's got this unique graphic and visual design, it feels very specific to this fight. Honestly, not much else for me to talk about with this fight. I just enjoy the dodgy and reactive nature of it. It's a good first boss to get the blood pumping and start off this alliance raid. As for something I don't really enjoy about this alliance raid, coming off of the first boss, this first ads room feels like it drags on for an eternity. Watching back the footage, it's only about 3 minutes long, which doesn't sound like a lot of time. But when you're actually playing it out, I don't know if it was just me or what, this felt like it took forever. You're just sitting here wailing on enemies that don't even fight back, there's no mechanics to speak of, and it's just incredibly boring. And I'm glad that in the newer alliance raids in Endwalker, they've really minimized these ad clear phase and made them far more interesting. On its own, this really doesn't sound that bad, but I guess when you're looking at a raid that's already 40 minutes in length pretty much, there's no reason to tack on this extra 3 minutes of hitting ads. It just doesn't do anything or add anything to the experience for the players. It's unfortunate too, because later in this raid, there's actually a really cool ads phase that tries something totally unique, and we'll talk about that in a couple minutes. This next boss fight is one of my favorites in this raid, and it's super interesting. Basically, the alliances will split up into their 3 groups and each take their own boss. But what makes it interesting is that your positioning as an alliance matters to the other alliances because of the way the boss's attacks behave. This laser stack you're seeing here is exactly what I'm talking about. Basically, every alliance is going to get one of these, and when you get hit by it, you take a magic vuln up. So if you happen to get hit by 2 of them due to poor positioning, you're dead like you're seeing in this footage. This means that everyone with the stack markers on them needs to be mindful of their positioning and be sure to face their lasers away from the other parties. Later in this run, this killed an entire alliance because A and B pointed their lasers at each other. It's a really fun little detail of team coordination, and you wouldn't think about it immediately until you see people die to it. There's also this neat little left-right dodge where you need to pay attention to what side the laser swords are on, and not get hit by the giant dash through the arena. Once again, a very straightforward and dodgy fight, but super fun, and the little elements of team coordination on top of that make for a pretty memorable experience and a well-designed split boss fight. Moving on towards the third boss, there's some really cool visuals as you enter the command room and you see the big monitor with the Yorhai logo on it. The third boss himself brings up one of my major complaints with the Nier raids as a whole, honestly, is the fact that it's too many just big robot enemies. I understand that these are probably references to the games that I'm missing, but at the same time, it feels really repetitive when you're just fighting big mech robot after big mech robot, and none of them look insanely unique. It just makes it so a lot of these bosses blend together in my head, and it's hard to remember which one is which. It wasn't until I replayed all of these raids for this video that I remembered, oh yeah, this boss does this. Mechanically speaking though, this is a more hectic and interesting boss than the previous two in my opinion. There's always a lot going on, it feels like, and the tells aren't as obvious as just, oh, there's a big red circle on the ground, I shouldn't stand in that. Once again, a really fun and dodgy fight just like the previous two, but it just ramps up the difficulty a little bit more, and it keeps you engaged. On the way to the final boss, we reach this ads phase I brought up earlier, which I think is really interesting in comparison to most others. Essentially, it's a big trek through these hallways with spider robots shooting laser beams at you, and as you get through more hallways, there's more things to avoid that stack on top of each other. As you progress through more of the hallways, they add barricades you need to destroy to progress further, these red orbs come back from the previous Nier raid, and it's overall just a much more interesting ads phase and transition between a boss fight in comparison to just, oh, kill this one big pack of ads for 3 minutes straight and then you're finally at the boss. It seriously has the most identity to me out of any intermission ads phase in this entire game. It's so unique and they never did anything like it again. I hope in the future they continue to try weird and experimental stuff like this. The final boss of this one is split into two phases. First you fight this big old ball, which is pretty straightforward, it dies really quick, but it's just the warm-up before you get to the real final boss. There's this super gross cutscene where all these fucking dolls that were meshed together in the ball fuse into a massive version of 2B. This is a pretty cool final encounter, and it borrows some mechanics from Sophia Extreme, actually, with projecting the attacks from the main boss into the clones that she spawns. Once again, just like I talked about in the previous video, I like how this boss utilizes cast bars and visual tells to telegraph her mechanics, rather than just putting a big red circle on the ground, because it makes repeat runs of this raid feel a lot more interesting than just, oh, I already know what to do, I'm falling asleep while I'm playing this. All in all, the Puppets Bunker is a great raid, and I think 7 is a deserving spot for this raid because, as good as it is, there's still a couple things I don't really love about it. Firstly, the boss designs, like I mentioned, I feel like just fighting robot after robot after robot is kind of boring. And again, maybe to people who have played all the Nier games, that sticks out more to them, and those bosses have more significance to them. But, to me, they just look like they're all the same robot, and it's not super visually exciting. Otherwise, that first ads clear phase is also insanely boring, and it just chunks on way too much extra time for a raid that's already really long as is. Still though, the Puppets Bunker is a great addition to the game. Coming in at the number 6 spot, we have our first Stormblood raid in the ranking with the Ritterana Lighthouse. I absolutely love the Stormblood raids in this game. I think all of them are amazing, and they're my personal favorite series of Alliance raids. I've never played Final Fantasy XII or Final Fantasy Tactics or any of the old games that these raids reference. I just love the visuals and I love the boss fights in these raids regardless. The first boss, Famfrit, is a nice chaotic start to things. He does a lot of different water mechanics, and the way that water actually behaves is that it stays active on the ground and does damage constantly if you're standing in it. This applies for pretty much all of the water attacks that he does. So not only do you need to avoid them, but you need to make sure that you don't stay standing in them if you do get hit because the hitbox is constant. Getting hit by this guy's water attack, like his big water cleave, is actually super punishing because the water has a constant knockback to it where if you get hit, you're pretty much going to be stuck in the entire blast. So if you don't have good mitigation up or your healers aren't keeping you alive, you're probably dead. I don't really know what else to say about this fight other than I really like it and I think it's a super great way to start off this Alliance raid. Skipping over a quick ads phase, we reach our second boss, Belius the Gigas. This guy's mechanics mostly revolve around time and clocks and stuff. He'll cover the entire arena in clocks, and you need to stand in the slow clocks and then move into the fast ones once they blow up, since they'll blow up in the speed that they're set at. He also spawns these towers, which are pretty unique as far as tower mechanics go. They have these clock hands on them that rotate when anyone steps on the platforms. You have to rotate the clock hands away from the party so that these meteors, when they land, shoot off a cleave away from everyone. But if you face the clock hands wrong, you can get the entire team cleaved. It's not your typical meteor where you have to soak the damage. He also spawns like these Ifrit nails that tether to people, and the tethered people just need to move far away from their nails so they don't take a bunch of burn damage. If you actually stand on the little clock that's coming out from the nail, you'll get frozen in time, so you don't want to do that. Make sure if you get that tether, you pull it away from people so they don't accidentally go running into that. I feel like this fight in specific's greatest strength is taking mechanics we already know as players and just changing them up a little bit with these clock mechanics to fit the identity of this boss, and it ends up creating some really interesting and unique mechanics that you only see within this fight. The ads phase before the third boss is kind of a weird one. You just wail on these iron golems that stand in one spot. You know, usually you have Alliance B go to the top, C to the right, and A to the left. But, I mean, again, it's just kind of a boring ads phase. Nothing really happens. It takes longer than it needs to, and it's filler, man. It's just filler. Doesn't need to be in the raid, and I don't think anyone really cares about it. The third boss, though, is a fucking classic. Construct 7, aka the math boss, aka 1 is not a prime number. This boss really is the perfect example of a unique mechanic that's gimmicky, it's weird, it's only within this raid, but everyone remembers this raid because of this mechanic. And it's stuff like this that I think every Alliance raid needs to have because it adds so much identity to the raid itself. Not saying every boss should have math involved, though. I think Construct 7 should keep that to himself. Basically, though, the boss will set everyone's health to like 1 HP, and then he'll ask you to like multiply by 5, make your health a prime number, or things of that nature, and then there's these plates along the ground that change what your health value is. And then you just need to, do whatever the boss says in order to not take a penalty or a debuff. This is a really fun fight, and I think it sticks out in most of our minds as one of the most iconic Alliance raid bosses in the entire game. He also has this cool little intermission full-on Ozma style where he pulls the whole party into a massive black hole. He's also just a funny-ass dude. Look at him. He's just like schmoovin' out here after he sends your whole party into a black hole. The final boss of this raid, Yasmat, I don't know how to say it. He has a super fucking sick design. He's like this big-ass dragon with a huge like sun heart core on him. You'll notice as you fight this guy, he takes like no fucking damage, and you spend like 5 minutes wailing on him, and he's just barely dying. It's because later in the fight, his heart becomes targetable, and when you destroy it, he takes a massive chunk of damage, and then you basically kill the boss. He also does like this magnet mechanic where you need to make sure you match with the opposite debuff so you don't get launched. It's pretty cool. I will say that mechanically speaking, this is probably my least favorite encounter in this raid, but visually, I think he's the absolute coolest. I still think it's a serviceable final encounter for this raid, probably just the weakest part of it in my opinion. Overall, the Ritterana Lighthouse is absolutely fantastic. There's just 5 other raids in this game I happen to like a little bit more than it. Kicking off the top 5 of my Alliance raid ranking, we have the Royal City of Rabanastre. I remember when I unlocked this raid for the first time, coming off the first 6 Alliance raids in the game, I was blown away by how much of a step up in quality this one was. I already loved stuff like the Weeping City of Mhach and Dune Scythe, but when I got to this one, I was blown away by how much better it was to me. The first boss of this raid, Mateus, is a pretty cool one. The boss will spawn a bunch of these water orbs around the arena, and then a figure skater in the middle that dances along the ice in this like spiral pattern. You don't want her to touch the water orbs, you need people to soak them, so that it doesn't spawn an ad when she dances around. If she touches the orb, it'll spawn an ad. There's also these little puddles that'll spawn that need 3 people to go into them to soak them. There's a lot going on in this fight, and it's a lot of fun. Later on in the fight, the boss soaks the arena in water and spawns these toad ads. You have to kill the toads to spawn air bubbles so that you can actually breathe while the arena is submerged with the water. I feel like this is a really strong way to start off an Alliance raid. The boss is just mechanically interesting enough to get you focused, but it's not overwhelming for a very first boss. After a quick ad clear phase, we reach Hashmal, the Bringer of Order. If you like the slice of right and the gold saucer, you'll be great at this fight, because his primary mechanic is spawning these big pillars and then cutting them down, and they'll fall in a certain pattern, so you need to pay attention to where they're going to tilt and dodge accordingly. He also spawns like some rock golem enemies at the end of the fight, but because we do so much damage nowadays in these old raids, you usually skip that part of the fight and don't have to deal with the ads at all. Otherwise, this is a pretty straightforward fight. There's some AoEs that go off along the ground, he does some dashes across the arena, typical stuff for your Alliance Raid boss. I also really love this boss's design, I think he looks super sick. Pretty solid encounter and a pretty memorable boss due to the big pillar cutting slices right style mechanic. After the second boss, there's like this cool cinematic section where you ride down the waterways into the underground part of the city, and it's super cool. I really like this part just for the whole cinematic value it adds to the raid. The view when you first arrive in the underground ruins part of the city looks absolutely beautiful. The third boss, Rofakali, is this cool chariot looking boss. In terms of fight specific mechanics, this guy doesn't have a whole lot going on, but he's still pretty cool. He'll split up into like a bunch of clones of himself and do a giant dash through the arena where you'll have to find the safe spot between them. He'll also spawn a couple ads and everyone will have to split up into their alliances and focus on each of the ads so he doesn't hit his enrage cast. His huge cinematic ultimate attack he does after you clear the ads is one of my favorites in the entire game. It looks super sick. Near the end of the fight, he spawns all these dark circles that everyone needs to interact with. They basically make it so the arena will be pitch black and you can't see him. And once you clear the arena of the dark circles, you'll be able to see where all his clones are, so you can dodge the dash in time. The final boss, Argoth Thedalphus, has one of my favorite designs in the entire game. He just looks fucking badass. His voice acting is also super sick, and it's another strength of these Stormblood raids I've alluded to mention so far, is that all of them have bosses with voice acting, which adds a lot to their characters. I feel like this is something that's lacking from, the previous two series of Alliance raids before the Stormblood ones, and something I'm really glad that the Endwalker Alliance raids have brought back. The main mechanic of this boss is this kind of Simon Says sort of thing, where you'll get either an angel on your screen or a devil on your screen. And if you get the angel on your screen, you want to do whatever the next mechanic tells you to, and if it's a devil, you want to do the opposite of whatever the next mechanic tells you to. He also does this cool little misdirection pointer finger thing, and I think this is the first time it shows up in the game, where basically you'll get this little finger above your head and you'll have to point it in whatever direction you're trying to move in. You can't move your character like you normally would. It's a nice way to make otherwise really simple dodges a little bit scarier. Overall, this is one of my favorite final bosses in any Alliance raid in the game. I love this dude's voice acting, his design, the whole angel devil mechanic. I just think this fight is completely fucking sick. Overall, 4 solid bosses combined with some great music and some awesome visuals make for a super good Alliance raid and one of the most memorable in the game for me personally. Coming in strong at the number 4 spot, we have the Tower at Paradigm's Breach, my favorite near raid in this entire game, and one of my favorite pieces of content in this game, period. I think it's absolutely amazing. The main flaw with this raid, and the first thing I want to mention, is it's just so long. This raid is like 45 minutes long. I think without a doubt it is the longest Alliance raid in this entire game, but despite that, I still absolutely love it, and I think every boss fight is absolutely amazing. The raid starts off super strong with the Knave of Hearts featuring one of my favorite boss themes in the entire game. And he's also just like a super cool looking boss coming off the previous 2 near raids where all the bosses were just a bunch of robots or mechs. This dude looks completely different and completely unique. The main mechanic is called stacking the deck, where he'll spawn a clone or 2 and then they'll get numbers on them, kind of like limit cut, and then in that order they're going to do an attack and you need to dodge accordingly. He also combines this attack with these blocks that spawn, and then you need to use the blocks accordingly to get knocked back in the right direction and to also dodge the attacks at the same time. A pretty simple fight, but the banging music combined with a really cool design makes it a really, really strong first encounter, and I enjoy it every time I fight it. The visuals in this raid are also extremely cool. I love like the white kind of digital world design that you see as you're going through the raid. The second boss of this raid is Hansel and Gretel. These two will rotate a debuff between each other. One of them will get a defense up and one of them will get an offense up. Basically, the one with the defense up will get a bunch of shields around them, Ravana style, and you won't be able to hit him except for at the front so that the tank can still keep hitting the boss while pulling him away from the team. Otherwise, the fight has some pretty straightforward dodgy mechanics where you just need to locate the safe spot and stand away from the bosses, stuff like that. I think all in all, it's a pretty cool double boss considering the debuff and how the party needs to rotate between both bosses rather than just kind of splitting up on both bosses and never interacting with the other one. Yeah, I'm gonna have to complain about another ads phase because as it is, this raid is already so long. There was no reason to include this intermission ads phase between the second and the third boss. It takes forever, it's boring, nothing is happening, and it doesn't need to be here. Now, on a much more positive note, the third boss in this raid, Red Girl, is absolutely incredible. I feel like this is probably the hardest Alliance raid boss in the entire game, in my opinion. I struggle with this one the most, but that's probably because I can count the amount of times I've done this raid on my hands. She'll spawn black and white blocks around the arena, and then players will get little AoEs around them that can actually break the blocks of the opposite color. This is cool because it means players have to use their AoEs to create safe spots for everyone, or to save people from a giant meteor attack later in the fight. There's a lot more individual responsibility in this fight compared to like any other 24-man fight in the entire game. There's also this cool little near minigame intermission where you get turned into the little hacking bits and you have to break this orange orb in the middle to free your alliance. It's pretty cool. I enjoy little like unique mechanics like this because not only is Red Girl already an incredibly challenging fight, but it also still does some fun gimmick mechanics like this as well. There's also this chain mechanic she does. I swear this one's the bane of my existence. I always end up walking into the orange no matter where I'm at. I'll either walk into the one in the middle, walk into the one on the sides, you name it. I always die to this fucking mechanic. There's just so much to talk about with Red Girl. This fight has so many mechanics. There's so much going on all the time, and there's a lot more party synergy required than like 90% of Alliance raid fights in this game. After Red Girl, you go up this elevator and you fight this mini-boss. Again, I much prefer these to your typical ad clear intermissions. This is way more fun. I like when there's actual mechanics as opposed to just, stand still and hit ads. The final boss is a two-phase fight, the False Idol. The first phase basically just introduces a couple of mechanics, and then it brings them back in the second phase, but with more variation added onto it. She does this mechanic where she basically like plays Tetris with these orbs, and when the orbs hit the bottom, they'll shoot a big laser beam out of where they land. It's a nice way to spice up your typical line AoE with adding a new visual tell to it that, again, adds identity to the fight. The second phase is where this boss really starts to get interesting, and the cutscene is super sick too. The boss will literally summon like whole ass buildings and shoot them up through the bottom of the stage. So you have to look under the stage, which is like see-through, and then go to the part that the building isn't gonna like rise up into. It's super cool. You can also get hit by a train in this fight if you're not careful. There's like traffic lights on the side, and if they're red, it'll be safe. And if it's green, there'll be a giant train that just rams right through there. There's also this cool mechanic where rings will start falling from the sky, and you'll get a black and white ring around you, and you'll need to face the corresponding color with the corresponding ring so you don't take damage. Overall, this final boss is super cinematic and an absolutely amazing conclusion to the longest and most grandiose Alliance raid in this entire game, in my opinion. It may not be my favorite Alliance raid in the entire game, but it is probably the most grand conclusion to any given set of Alliance raids in the game so far, and I cannot wait to see what the third and final Endwalker raid looks like, if this is anything to go by. Coming in at the number 3 spot in my Alliance raid ranking, we have Euphrazine, the latest Alliance raid in the game. From this point onwards, my top 3 can be interchanged depending on the day. The next 3 we're going to talk about are just absolutely amazing, and I love all of them. Right off the bat, Euphrazine has some of my favorite Alliance raid music in the entire game. The Aglaya and Euphrazine music is just absolutely phenomenal. I cannot wait to hear what the final Myths of the Realm raid music sounds like. Nafika is the first boss and a great start to the raid. The kind of main mechanic in this fight is when she spawns the yellow and blue ring and then does yellow and blue kind of like circle AoEs, and you just stand in the corresponding color so you don't take a lot of damage. You see a lot of people dead on the floor in this footage because this is day 1 footage, but you get the point. Another thing I like about this fight is that the in and out AoEs that she does are telegraphed by the color that they are, so it's not just, again, as simple as standing where the orange circle is not. All in all, a great start to the raid and a super good Alliance raid boss. The visuals are also super good in this raid. I mean, these are some of the best visuals in any Alliance raid so far. I really can't wait until 6.5 to see what the hell the third one looks like. After Nafika, there's this cool little behemoth mini-boss you have to fight after clearing some ads. Althik and Nimia is a pretty fun double boss. Nimia will draw different cards with different effects. You can get motion and stillness, you can get, look away from the boss or look towards the boss, different stuff like that. At the same time, Althik does some cleaves and some different ground AoEs people have to avoid and whatnot. This is also one of the few 24-man bosses with an actual enrage. Nimia and Althik have like a buff under their health bar with like 10 minutes on it, I believe. And if that buff runs out, they do a big wipe attack and they kill everyone. Otherwise, there's some cool fast-forwarding time stuff that Althik does. He can like put a clock on you and fast-forward your time, so whatever debuff you have goes off faster and stuff like that. Skipping over to Halone, we see one of the coolest areas visually in the entire game, in my opinion. I love this whole like ice section of Euphrazine near the end. It looks so good. Halone's main mechanic is basically a memory game called Tetrapagos, where she'll show you on the ground what order the AoEs are going to go off in, and then you need to act accordingly and dodge them. As you can see on day one, this killed a lot of us. This to me is a pinnacle of one of those really dodgy fights where you can see everything before it comes out and it's well telegraphed. You just need to execute on it and it comes out fairly quickly. Halone is a really fun fight and probably my favorite in this entire Alliance raid and one of my favorite Alliance raid bosses in this entire game. Menphina is the final boss in Euphrazine and another really cool fight. Menphina's mechanics mostly revolve around using her dog in combination with her to do different cleave attacks, and also these moon AoEs that spawn, where like the moon will slowly fill up, and then when it fills, it'll do a big AoE. Something I really enjoy about Euphrazine, and also the Stormblood raids that I didn't really mention, is the pacing. I feel like these get the perfect pacing for a 24-man. I feel like Circus Tower and Labyrinth are a little too short, and I feel like some of the Nier raids are a little too long. I feel like this middle ground that the Stormblood raids got and that these Endwalker raids are now getting is just the perfect 24-man pacing in that 25 to 30 minute range. Euphrazine is seriously a great raid, and it was the first Alliance raid I got to play on day one, which is a really awesome experience, so this raid will always be somewhat special to me in that way as well. That being said, there are still 2 more Alliance raids in this game that I think are a little bit better, and I like them just a little bit more. The Orban Monastery is my second favorite Alliance raid in the entire game. It is absolutely incredible. Not only do the visuals look great, but all 4 bosses in this raid are like 4 of my favorite Alliance raid bosses ever. There are no misses at all in this raid. The raid starts off with this absolutely gorgeous view of this waterfall as you head towards the first boss. Mustadio is our first encounter, and he's an absolutely great start to the raid. This cutscene where he perches up on the tower and snipes the entire party is fucking dope. This is how you start off a fucking 24-man. I do appreciate how he uses his cast bar to telegraph his left and right floor cleaves, because hey, at this point in the game when you've made it through most of Stormblood, you should know how to read a cast bar by now. This tether mechanic he does with the ads is pretty cool too. He'll tether to a bunch of these robots, they'll turn red and shoot a big laser beam out from where they're standing, so you gotta look around the arena and find the safe spot between them all. Also, this can be said about every single boss in this raid, but again, the voice acting here is amazing. The voice acting throughout the entirety of Orban Monastery is some of the best Alliance raid voice acting in the entire game. The second boss, Agrius, is one of my favorite uses of the duty action mechanic in the entire game. I felt like the duty action mechanic in stuff like Lakshmi and O11 is kind of boring and not really that interesting. It almost just feels like pointless padding to the fight. But in this fight in specific, I feel like the duty action mechanic is used really well with the sword and the shield. You see, she'll spawn like these swords and shields around the map, and when she spawns shields, you'll need to pick one up and then wait as she casts Judgment Blade, pop the shield, and then you'll be able to block the attack without getting knocked across the arena. For the sword mechanic, she'll encase a bunch of the party members in ice, and then people who aren't frozen will have to go pick up the sword, walk up to the ice, and go slash it with the sword they picked up. Just the simple alternation between 2 different duty action that she spawns on the field makes for a fight that feels so much more interesting than any of the other fights that use duty actions in this game, in my opinion. I feel like a 24-man of all places is the best area to use these duty actions as opposed to like Lakshmi or O11 like I mentioned earlier. On the way to the third boss, there's a little mini-boss called the Dark Colossus. I don't have a whole lot to say about this guy, he's really straightforward, but he's not bad by any means, and I'm not complaining about his inclusion here. Now, the third boss, the Thunder God, is probably my favorite 24-man boss in the entire game. This guy is so fucking cool, and I've never played Final Fantasy Tactics or Final Fantasy XII or whatever the fuck this guy is from, but he is cool as fuck regardless. This dude immediately asserts his dominance by just inflicting the entire party with Doom right off the bat. That's his first mechanic. You all have fucking Doom. I really like the way this boss utilizes the arena in his fight. Like, different players will get different debuffs that force them to spread away from their, respective alliance that they're split into. But because there's 3 alliances split around the entire boss, everyone has to use their little chunk of the arena well, so that they don't accidentally kill another alliance with bad positioning or whatever. This seems like one of the harder alliance raid bosses in this game. I see a lot of people struggle with this one when I get him in Duty Finder. And I think that's largely because his tells are very fight specific. The way he telegraphs his attacks and the markers he has in his fight, you don't really see them anywhere else. This fight is very, very unique. His huge ultimate attack that he does after the little ads phase is so fucking sick. This boss is the absolute pinnacle of Alliance Raid voice acting. The entire time you're fighting this guy, he's just like slinging off some poetry at your ass. Without a doubt, my favorite 24-man boss in this entire game, and it's hard for me not to put this raid at number 1 for how much I fucking love this encounter. But there's just one raid I like a little bit more. The final boss is Ultima, but not that Ultima. I really like this fight because out of any final boss in any Alliance raid, this one feels like the most conclusive of the entire series. What I mean by this is that she uses different attacks from different bosses from the previous 2 Stormblood raids. She'll summon like Bellius the Gigas or whatever, and he'll do his time shit on the floor, all while she's doing her own mechanics. The whole first phase of this boss is basically just her summoning the old bosses that you fought in the previous raids, while doing a couple of mechanics of her own. It eventually leads into this absolutely insane phase transition where you're falling through like the abyss, and this decrepit head of Ultima bashes her face into the barrier that you've created, and you have to kill it before it kills the team. Again, this is the type of spectacle you want to see in a 24-man. Like, this shit is memorable, this shit is intense. The second phase of this fight is pretty cool. I like the mechanic where she uses wind to basically push these line AoEs, so you need to stand in the AoE so it gets pushed off of you, essentially. At the end of the fight, she does this crazy maze shit where she sets up this maze, and a bunch of players will get a stillness debuff where they need to stop moving as soon as that number reaches 0, or they just get absolutely nuked. This is a very cool and cinematic way to end off this raid. It's such an interesting final Alliance raid boss, and there's nothing else quite like it. It's not my favorite encounter in this raid by any means, but I still think this is a super cool conclusion to the entirety of the Ivalice raids. All in all, Orban Monastery is an absolutely incredible raid, and if I played it on content back when it was new, this might have been my favorite raid in this game to this day, but there's just one other raid, a more recent raid, that I happen to love a little bit more. If you hadn't guessed it already by process of elimination, Aglaia is my favorite Alliance raid in the entire game. Aglaia was the first 24-man I did when it was on content and it was kind of new. I was still a couple months late to it because I took a break from the game, but it was still kind of the first Alliance raid I ever did on content, and I think for that, it really holds a special place to me. Personal biases aside though, this raid is still absolutely incredible. All 4 boss fights are great, the visuals are stunning, and the pacing of this raid compared to any other Alliance raid in the game, I think this has the best pacing they've ever done. On top of the fact you're fighting the literal fucking 12, which is probably the coolest concept of an Alliance raid series so far. The raid throws you straight into Byregat, the first boss, and he does a bunch of cool stuff with the arena and manipulating the arena with like hammers and stuff to try to knock you off the platform. There's so much weight and power behind all of these swings that Byregat does with his huge hammer. It makes you really feel like you're actually fighting the literal god of creation. It's so sick. When I first loaded into this raid, I was just blown away by the fact that it started off with Byregat the Builder. Right after Byregat is where another major strength of this raid comes into play to me. There are no ad clear bullshit filler phases in this entire raid. There are 4 bosses and 2 mini bosses, and that is the whole thing. This is the primary reason I placed Aglaia above Euphrazine, is it's so weird to me that in Aglaia, it felt like they just nailed this perfect fucking pacing, and then in Euphrazine they're like, we're just gonna bring back a bunch of packs of ads and you can wail on them for no reason for 5 minutes. Mini bosses like this are just infinitely more interesting because there's mechanics going on, and it makes me sad because I feel like ads phases don't need to be so boring. I feel like they could easily combine mechanics like you're seeing in this mini boss with a bunch of packs of ads you have to deal with at the same time to create for a much more interesting balancing act and juggling act of, adds and mechanics. I guess this distaste that I keep mentioning towards ad phases isn't the fact that ad phases can't be good, it's just that they don't do them in an interesting way at all. They're always boring and they're always the same. Again, this is why I commended the Puppets Bunker so much for its weird ad phase between the third and fourth boss. It's so unique, and there's actually a balancing act of juggling mechanics and fighting ads at the same time. I really hope we see something cool like that in the third and final Myths of the Realm raid when we get that in 6.5. The second boss, Ralgar, is an absolute spectacle. I mean, you literally fight him on the Hand of the Destroyer. The main gimmick for this one is that Ralgar has a blue and a red portal, and he can either punch the blue or the red one, or he can send different mechanics through the different portals, and they have to be resolved in a myriad of ways. One of my favorite mechanics in this entire fight is when he spawns this huge meteor proximity marker, but you actually have to stand on top of it, because he's gonna punch the meteor, and it shatters into a bunch of little meteors that spread out around the rest of the arena. Overall, Ralgar is one of my favorite Alliance Raid bosses in this entire game. I love the way his mechanics subvert your expectations, but once you know how to do them, they all make sense. On the way to the third boss, there's the two lions. These are like a mini-boss. Pretty solid mini-boss. They'll both do different attacks with different numbers assigned to them, so then they'll do that attack in those orders, and you need to do like an in and an out and stuff. Not a ton to talk about when it comes to a mini-boss like this, but I'm just glad it's here. Azima is the third boss, and one of the coolest Alliance Raid bosses in this entire game. This might be my favorite boss in this raid, if not Nald'thal. She'll spawn these clones of herself on the arena that have like a wind ability, and wherever the clone is standing, they're going to push the AoE away from themselves. So the clones will actually be the safe spot because the wind doesn't hurt you. I feel like Aglaya in general just has so many mechanics that make sense once you've seen them, but they trip you up if you haven't seen them before because they're a little bit unintuitive. My favorite mechanic in this fight is kind of like this triangle arena she puts you in, where she'll send a knockback in 3 directions, and you need to memorize it like a memory game, and then get knocked in those 3 directions without getting pushed into the lava. This is like an incredibly easy dodge, but it's really fun to just get knocked back and forth in this triangle. It's truly amazing how consistent the bosses are in Aglaya. Like, all of them are so memorable. All of them have their own unique mechanics that make them stand out, and I just love all of the bosses in this raid. The final boss is Nald'thal, and just like the other bosses in Aglaya, he does some trolly mechanics where you look at them and you think you understand how to dodge them, and then he switches it up last second to throw you off. He even has like fake stack markers and fake proximity markers that he'll put on players sometimes. My favorite mechanic has got to be this Thal's Balls mechanic where he summons a bunch of meteors in the sky, and you have to run like back and forth like Mario Kart style to avoid all the explosions. It's like super fun and super fast paced, and there's some crazy optimization that can be done here too. If you know where the safe spots are, you can like minimize your movement and just move slightly back and forth. It's so cool. I saw like a clip on Twitter the other day of someone doing it perfectly. He also has this Scales of Judgment mechanic he does later in the fight, but I don't actually have any footage of it because I've noticed that the boss dies nowadays before he gets to the ads phase because we just do so much damage already in 6.3. The Scales mechanic is kind of like a cool balancing act where you need to get enough people on each side of the arena. It gets divided into 2, and then the ads that you kill also count as weight for the scales, so you need to pay attention to what sides of the scales the bodies died on, so that you can pull more people to where the bodies are not, and stuff like that. It's pretty simple. The problem is, if one person in your Duty Finder group decides to fuck it up or troll or whatever, it wipes the entire party if you fail the scales. So in a sense, I am very glad that scales are skippable pretty easily now, and most parties are able to meet the damage to just skip the scales entirely. All in all though, I absolutely love this raid. It's my favorite raid in the entire game. Orban Monastery is a close second, and depending on the day, I might have put that one above Aglaya, but I think Aglaya is just, it's probably the Alliance raid I've done the most that I still enjoy to this day an absolute ton. But yeah, all in all, the pacing for this raid is incredible. The voice acting, I'm so glad there's voice acting again because there wasn't any in the Shadowbringer 24-mans, the Nier raids. So I'm so glad that's made a return for the 12. It gives their characters so much more personality and intrigue. The music is also just so fucking good in these Myths of the Realm raids so far. I prefer the Aglaya music a little bit to the Euphrazine music, but they're both just so damn good, and I can't wait to see what the third raid has to offer. But yeah, that's going to do it for my Alliance raid ranking. I know this video was even longer than the first one because It's really easy for me to sit here and just ramble about alliance raids for a long ass time. Feel free to drop your ranking in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you guys think of these raids. What's your favorite? What's your least favorite? And everything in between. Let me know. Also, before I end this video, I wanted to announce within a video now that I do have a join membership option on my channel now. So if you're interested in supporting the channel a little bit for a couple bucks a month, the option is there. You'll get a shout out in all of my videos, and you'll get a little Moogle badge next to your name in the comments. The perks are pretty bare bones at the moment because I don't want to isolate anyone who watches my content for free. I'm not trying to make this so, you get a week early access to a video if you buy this subscription. Like, it's just an option that's there if you want to support my channel a little bit more. Anyways, drop a like on the video, but only if you did, and subscribe to the Big Blue Purple channel if you're new around here. And if you made it this far, hey, what are you doing? Just subscribe. Anyways, thank you all for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.